Welcome back to Practice Underwater. I'm here with our Director of Mastermind, Dr. Alex Sharp, and I'm really excited for today's episode. Alex, for those of you who don't know, is one of our super listeners. I think him and Peyton Keller I put in a class by themselves. They know this podcast better than I do. And, what makes Alex really cool is he's had the experience of owning a group practice, growing a practice, pre-ownership, and he really embodies a lot of what our audience is all about. And so, Alex is here today, and we're going to recap some old episodes of Practice Underwater and really talk about some takeaways. And so maybe some things he took that maybe you might have missed or I didn't realize at the time.
Well, George, you brought up something that I talked to a lot of our mastermind members about recently, which is the progression. We all start with being the angsty dental student, the angsty pre-owner, and we progress through solo to group or whatever the right method is for you. But, I ended up going straight from associate to group practice. Some people might stair-step their way through different progressions, but really it's helpful to realize that we all start somewhere. And you mentioned the mastermind, and we've got people in the mastermind that are at all different levels right now. And it's a really cool thing to see everyone bloom and grow.
Yeah. And it's fun because I think, the way I equate it is like, you almost feel like sometimes mentorship is like a time machine. You view yourself in the past and you're sort of watching that person go somewhere where you've been. The whole ask me how I know thing that I always say on air, that means something. That means I've been there. Ask me how I know what that's like.
Right. Well, I recorded an episode with Peyton and Tyler yesterday, actually, and we talked about how one of our main goals is to shorten people's learning curve.
Yes.
Because there's guys in dental school with way more knowledge than I had 3 years out of dental school. And I think that learning curve is going to continue to shorten and shorten, where we have people probably coming into their D1 year having a much clearer vision of what they want for their lives than what many people have decades out of school.
It's funny because we talk about the honeymoon phase on air every once in a while. And that's the one that to me really stands out. It's like when I graduated, bought my practice, had this period of, really high growth and then this huge crash. It was like a year of ownership for me where I was just like really confused on what was happening. I had no clue. And I mean, now, we have clients and they'll be like, well, yeah, right now it's a little high, but this is the honeymoon phase. And I'm like, man, you know that? You know how much like heartbreak and just agony that caused me learning that lesson?
Well, it's like Matt said, it's the thought leader tax. You had to bear the brunt of being the originator of that idea. And to originate that idea, guess what? You had to live it. You had to be in it.
Yeah, for me, that's the one that always stands out as of all the lessons, the painful ones, that one was the worst. That was 6 months of confusion and me trying to really figure out what was wrong with my practice.
But think about the gratification that you have now of helping people to navigate around that, through that, over that, to where you're keeping them from having to deal with all the agony. Now it's a known fork in the road for people. They know which way to go now.
Well, and that's what keeps me going. It's that idea that we can keep finding those, I call them gems, or like little lost hidden pearls in dentistry that, areas where people haven't ventured, they haven't figured things out, they haven't gone. Those are the areas we want to go and figure out because that's the fun.
Well, and it's interesting because we talk a lot about the shared practices way, the shared practices Kool-Aid. And in a way, ironically, that's ever evolving.
Well, yeah.
Where, like for season 6, a big focus has been getting crystal clear on vision, because that's an element that has always been discussed, but almost glossed over because we favor practice ownership without saying, well, wait a second, what's my point B? Where do I want to really be? Like what type of practice do I need to focus on either acquiring or starting to get me to that point B? And so now that's a major part of our coaching, our mastermind, is getting as clear as you possibly can be on the front end about that vision. And I think that's one of those pearls that we picked up along the way when we realized, hold up, it's not just ownership, it's ownership with the destination in mind.
Yeah, and like in today's episode, we're really going to go back through some old Practice Underwaters. And when I think about older episodes, I've had it's not a great experience listening to some old interviews I've done because I'm almost shaking myself like, why aren't you taking it this way? and then you kind of watch yourself. So I think even if you listen to the whole progression of practice underwater, you can watch our philosophy really unfold.
Yeah, and a lot of the metrics, a lot of the things that you look for, a lot of the things that you coach on now, you had not yet fully crystallized a year ago or a year and a half ago when you started doing the practice underwater segments. Now you have a much different checklist, a much different lens through which you look at people's practice by numbers dashboards, the way you look at people's staffing, the way you look at people's physical footprints of their office. You've really clarified your own method, and all of the coaching clients, all the mastermind clients have really benefited from that. But yeah, I mean, you're going to kick yourself by saying, why didn't I see that issue a year and a half ago? But you get better every day.
So which previous episodes of Practice Underwater really stood out to you?
Man, I think James's episode was one of the top tier ones for me, just because it was so relatable for me personally, being in a group practice scenario, to see where he started, because he was working in the office as an associate, and he ended up being able to have the opportunity to buy it from the multi-practice owner who owned several offices. And it was in a unique scenario where he already had the goodwill. He already had the team as on board as he could be, being a new owner. And just to see where he started and then knowing behind the scenes where he's ended up, like it's really cool.
And James is a cool one. I mean, so by the way, Alex has gone through some old notes and Practice Underwater episodes to prepare for this interview, and I didn't. And so, for me, I was almost nervous if he's going to bring up one I didn't remember. But James is a softball, that's a guy that I know well. And it's such a cool case for him, because I remember on his first interview, his chief complaint was the practice just can't grow. He's like, I don't know where we can do more, be more. And from my perspective, I was looking at it as, okay, you have these two hygienists with one assistant. So you're kind of running this like super inefficient assisted hygiene. Then you have two dentists, each seeing patients out of one operatory with one assistant, with very little new patient flow. And so I'm looking at it as, I can't see a way not to grow this. It's like we can grow our hygiene department. And then what we ended up doing in his practice, so he started with 5 ops. So that's why they had the 3 chairs for hygiene and then 1 for each doctor. And then over COVID, we equipped the other 2. So then he had 7. So then with the 7 ops, we got an extra hygiene assistant, and then we ran 4 columns of hygiene. And then he had 2 columns for his own restorative work, and then his associate out of 1 column. And then the only other thing that we really did with him is we then helped him associate coach his associate on being more confident, diagnosing the way that she knows it should be done, and working with patients and being confident in the room. And I mean, how many things was that? Like 1, 2, 3, 4?
Right. And my favorite part of it was the leadership growth that James undertook with that, because he started out feeling bad, feeling guilt for wanting what he wanted, which was stabilize the income, grow the income. Yeah, great. But have a better quality of life. And he achieved, it was a both and scenario where he wanted to maintain or grow the income and have more time off and have the choice hours at the office, and put aside that guilt that he was feeling for having the associate do what he didn't want to do, which in reality, that's sort of the point of having an associate. Like, you have to be able to expand capacity. And with James, he grew as a leader by being able to say, this is what I want, and to be audacious enough to have that clarity, to have the practice meet his goals. And just to be clear, all of the stuff that George talked about with James, he didn't see without the extra set of eyes that came from coaching. If you don't have coaching, you don't have someone else looking at things objectively, you're going to get in your own head and you're going to see the inherent limitations, when in fact a coach or just someone to help you out is going to be able to be more clear on some things that you couldn't be otherwise.
Well, and to really speak to the point of mastermind, right, there's a reason why Alex Sharp is the person that we have heading up our mastermind. I mean, for me, he has been the definition of mastermind. I mean, him and I have very similar practices. And I remember, how long ago was it now that we had the split shifting conversation? Like May?
Yeah, it was 6 months ago.
Yeah. So around April-ish, May, sometime at the very beginning of coming back from COVID, Alex really helped me realize that Alex pushed me. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to open up that much capacity by split shifting my team and opening up evenings. I was like, I could see it opening up maybe a couple hours a day, but I don't really think it would add up to much. And Alex really pushed back on it. He's like, no, it's significant. And so then I mapped it out, and I kind of calculated how many hours I could get in hygiene if I split shifted my team. And it turns out that 25% extra capacity in hygiene, which for me is 25% growth in my whole practice. And so once I saw that, like I remember the moment that I was in, it was in my office, and I was kind of scribbling on this little piece of scratch paper, and I looked down, and I thought, oh, bleep, I have to do this, man. And then my stomach dropped, my chest got tight, and I thought, I'm going to have so many uncomfortable conversations. Thanks, Alex. And I did. And, now at this point, the thing I love is that, Alex got to have the same, I got to have the same conversation with him in reverse.
Yeah, because the dirty little secret of that is we came up with this great plan, and then I was too chicken crap to do it in my own practice. But George jumped in and did it because my excuse was, well, I've got 10 operatories, I don't need to do it. But then after George lambasted me for not doing it, I remapped it out and came up with a spreadsheet and came up to the same mathematical conclusion. And I'm like, oh man, I am leaving a lot of growth and new patient flow and everything on the table by not doing this. So priority one, by the end of Q4 is to work with my office manager and get that figured out.
And it's funny because, from our perspective, right, it takes someone else. I think we tend to avoid the uncomfortable areas, right? We both, right? I mean, I've already done it. I had hygiene tiers already that we've gone through to get to the new schedule. You've got hygiene tiers upcoming. And, it's like, yeah, who wants to do that, right? Like, we're as owners naturally going to avoid that part of our practice that requires those uncomfortable things. And it takes somebody pushing you, a peer-to-peer relationship, where says, no, like, this is what's best. And having someone back you and have that mindset that we both have, and it's not like, and I feel like you draw the line at some point. You do what's best for the business, but you also don't ask something of people that you wouldn't be willing to do.
Right. And that dichotomy, that I actually posted about that in the mastermind this week, where I was posing the question to everyone, like, okay, where is the balance between doing what serves you and your practice the best, but yet also having principles, like time-tested principles of like stoicism and leaders eat last, like by Simon Sinek, where what you do is emblematic of what you want your team to do, where you wouldn't do anything that you don't ask of your team. And to me, those are two very disparate modes of thinking. I'm going to sacrifice myself the way that I would of my team, which has been my thing, unfortunately, for a lot of my practice ownership, where I like to model that behavior sometimes to a fault, versus we're building this engine to power my life, my ideal practice, my dreams. So, it's a difficult thing where you reach a level where you're comfortable with your income and you're like, if we continue this in perpetuity, then we're good. But then the other side of the coin is, well, why not grow? Why not be better? And that's why the split shifting thing took a back seat for me, because I was like, I'm comfortable. Why mess with it? But then we're leaving opportunity on the table by not doing it.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to, boundaries, right? It's your job as the owner. You work for the business and you have to do what's best for the business. But at the same time, you have to have that so for me, my boundaries are 6 p.m. on a weekday and 2 p.m. on Friday, no weekends. So 7 to 6 Monday to Thursday, 7 to 2 on Friday, and that's it. And so I told my team that. I said, look, this is just what I believe. Those are my limits on what I'm going to ask of people. That's just what I feel good about. And I think everyone has that different answer, right? I know offices that go 7 to 7 Monday to Friday, 7 to 2 on Saturday. And that's what that person must feel okay with. But, I think everyone has their own line. But once you have your boundary, at that point, within your boundary of ethical things that you're comfortable with, you have to do whatever the business requires. And I think, imagine if, right, like on our roles and responsibilities as owners of our practices, the checklist goes, do what's best for your practice, be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with team members, be willing to take risks to grow your practice. Those are the roles and responsibilities for this job. And it takes, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that highlights the fact that there are so many hats that owner dentists wear.
Oh, yeah.
You have the entrepreneur hat, you have the manager hat, you have the technician hat. And honestly, in dental school, we're trained so well to be the technician, and you have to really get good at embracing the entrepreneurial hat to say, like, I have to be bold in the marketplace. I have to up my marketing budget to an uncomfortable level. I have to do what I have to do to grow the business. And, those are so many different skill sets, and flexing that entrepreneurial muscle is uncomfortable. It's not the easiest muscle to work out, but once you get there and you practice those conversations and you practice those ways of thinking, it gets easier the more you do it.
Speaking of uncomfortable conversations, it would be a real big letdown if we didn't talk about Albert in this episode.
Do we have to?
We have to talk about Albert. So for anyone who is wondering why we were laughing, Albert was a guest that Matt, my partner, had interviewed on Practice Underwater. And Albert about grinded my gears more than any other guest has ever, just got under my skin. And kind of my famous opening lines are, if you ever wonder why average is average, you're going to find out right now. And
what did Matt call? He called him Mr. Right Answer.
That was me. Yeah, I called him Mr. Right Answers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was just this 2-part series of just really, really hard to listen to, for at least from my. Was it hard to listen to?
It was like bordering on masochistic to listen to it. Like it was. Oh man, because you almost could guess what he was going to say. Like after he answered a couple of Matt's questions, you're like, he's going to answer this in the most stereotypically dull way possible, or he'll give like a trite self-help kind of answer, but then you would know that he wasn't going to follow through with it.
And that was the part I was trying to figure out, what about it got under my skin. And because I think it reflects to some degree on, usually when something really bothers you about somebody, it's usually like that same thing. You have that same quality, you just don't like it about yourself. And so I was trying to figure out why he really got under my skin. And for me, I value awareness so much. I try so hard to search for awareness on what is my issue, why am I not seeing something. And I think one of my fears is that I'll have the awareness and not act on it. And so I always act on the awareness, and he was like, the whole interview was totally aware of everything he was doing wrong, yet changed nothing. And that was really hard to sit with. I'll just pull up one example. Was his office is open Monday through Friday, and even like a half day Saturday, right?
Yeah, but it was weird hours during the week. Like it was very irregular hours, and it was based on when the part-time hygienist wanted to be there.
Well, no, that was the thing I was about to say. He was there the whole time.
Yeah.
He was there Monday through Friday and a half day Saturday.
Yeah.
But his hygienist was only there like 20 hours a week.
Yeah.
She was there like 7 to 2, 3 days a week.
He was doing doctor stuff while there was no hygienist there, which is insane.
And so it's like, you're not doing any exams. You're not diagnosing anything. And he was like, well, I don't want her to leave, so I'm not going to ask her to switch her days. I'm like, okay, so for the last 13 years, you have worked this super inconvenient schedule because you're afraid of an uncomfortable conversation with a hygienist? Like,
you don't want to talk to her for 2 minutes and fix it. Yeah.
So that was one that, that was a really hard one. And again, like, I think that comes up so much. And that was like a really extreme example. But right, like the split shifting in your practice and, for me, perio in my practice, there are things that we all don't do well. And a lot of them have to do with uncomfortable conversations we choose not to have.
Well, you mentioned that it's an extreme example. Like, yeah, in our ecosystem, it seems extreme. But the problem is...
Oh, that's average.
That's average. Like, that's the freaking norm, man. Like, for those of us that have looked at lots and lots of different practices to acquire or different opportunities, most of those practices fall in that realm of they collect 500 to 700,000, one hygienist, one dental assistant.
Do you know what baffles me?
What?
So 675, that's average by the ADA.
Right.
Average. That means half are above,
Mm-hmm.
and more amazingly, half are below.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah, assuming the median's about the same as the average, yeah. And that's what's crazy is there's those big giant mega practices that skew that average to the right
that's
somewhat.
Median.
Yeah. So median is if median 675, then yeah. That means there's so many little tiny practices around. Wild.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't. That's a hard one for me to be with, you know.
But it's the lack of education. It's the lack of knowing what's possible. It's the lack of exposure to other ways of seeing things. And honestly, it's the lack of mentorship and coaching, because you don't know what you don't know. That's something that gets thrown around all the time and people get tired of hearing it, but you don't know what you don't know until someone else opens your eyes.
Yeah, and in Albert's case, back to his hygienist, it's like if you at the end of the day, every employee has to be there doing what's best for the practice. And if they're not doing that, if they're not valuable to the overall practice, then they either have to become valuable or they have to go.
And that's a tough major gray area that we're contending with in our office right now, is where's that line between growing a team member to where they are a valuable contributor to the practice versus, okay, when do you draw the line to say, okay, we've poured in everything we can pour into this person, when do we cut ties? And it comes down to clarity and communication. Communicate where the bar is, where the expectation is, and then you have an amount of time to say, here's how long you have to get to the bar, and then if you don't reach the bar in the predetermined amount of time, then you have to say bye-bye.
How many people have you fired?
I can count them on one hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can barely more than one hand.
Yeah.
For me, it's almost like when we get somebody, we have a 90-day trial period, is what we say.
Right.
And then I will almost, if they make it past 6 weeks, they're staying with us forever. Mm-hmm. But usually the first 6 weeks, we'll turn through people. Because, and it's never a surprise. Like, we've never one time, but that was totally my fault. I hired somebody. I'll just tell the story. We hired this person for kind of a sterile tech, like low-level dental assistant type position. And then we realized that I saw it in my practice, and I just didn't like the way that was. And so then we pivoted to hiring a more functional assistant that can do more things, pay her more, and then that allowed us to add a lot more value. So that was a mistake on my end. And so, for her, it was like, my office manager was letting her know that we had a change of vision. And, that's awkward. Well, it was a change of vision, right? Like, I didn't like, she was fine at her job, but just, it wasn't what I wanted. And so we had to undo that one. But other than that, they've always been like not surprised at all. Like, I was expecting this, for some reason, it just wasn't clicking, but that, I think when you fire somebody, it should be at the point where they know, if they know that, like, if they're like, oh yeah, I was expecting this, I was about to quit, that's how you know it's a good fire.
Right. Because if not, you're not communicating. And that's why in our practice, we're big on every 90 days, there's a one-on-one meeting where it's a 2-on-1, but it's myself, my office manager, and each team member, where they have a chance to say what's going well, what's not going well, and then we can give feedback. And true to the traction philosophy, we grade everyone based on our core values, how well they're embodying them, and then how well are they at the bar of their job description. And so that gives us a chance to say objectively, here's what we see, here's where the deficiencies are, and here's where we need you to be in the next 90 days when we sit back down and see where you're at.
One thing I'll say about, you in your practice with traction, you've implemented those philosophies better than anyone else I've ever heard of. I mean, we do like the departmental meetings with that same type of format. We do our KPIs and like the issue IDS and all that stuff. I mean, but you, like, that is like Bible in your practice.
Well, it has to be, and it hasn't completely trickled down to the individual departments yet. Like for us, we run the IDS system as a leadership team, and then starting Q1 of 2021, each team lead is going to run the traction style level 10s
meetings.
Within the department. That's the next step.
Are you going to be in on those meetings?
I'm going to be filtering through. So like they're all going to occur at once, and then I'll pop into each one.
Oh, that's cool.
But the idea is to make it to where my team leads are, they have the authority to run those meetings, and that I train them well enough. Because if you look at the ideal organizational chart of a dental office, my main points of contact should be my office manager and my team leads. Yeah. Therefore, my non-clinical time needs to be spent training those team leads to become leaders. Mm-hmm. Because if they're just if I have like a glorified dental assistant being my lead dental assistant, who does that really help? Like she needs to have leadership training. She needs to have the presence to actually move those other dental assistants forward and be the intermediary between the dental assistants and the hygienist, the dental assistants in the front office, to where you have that cohesion between all the different teams.
So we've already kind of talked about your practice underwater interview. Can we talk about it again?
Yeah.
So a lot of what you're hearing Alex talk about right now is, if you remember, there was an interview with this guy. We had a pet detective, Ace Ventura. And so that was Alex. And, it was a lot of these things were the conversation of part 2, where it was team leads, office manager, and that whole setup. And, I think talk about what it was like before that, before that practice underwater interview. What did it feel like?
Well, it felt like I was the rate limiting step in everything. Like I had my hand in every cookie jar. I did payroll. I did everything. And that was a holdover of taking over a practice that had some systems, but I felt like I had to learn all the systems first. So I learned all the systems, and I was hesitant to delegate, hesitant to embolden anyone to be a team lead. And that's where you read the book Traction and you're like, oh man, my world is shaken and I need to build it from the ground up.
So what was holding you back? Fear
of not having my finger on the pulse of the way things were going in the practice. And you alleviate that fear by training, by working with people, by trusting in the process. A common phrase that gets thrown around is the trust but verify, to where you're delegating but not abdicating.
Yeah, oh man. So you have started to step back. And I don't know if you've experienced this yet, but every time I've taken a step back, I sort of look at my practice and I'm like waiting for something to fall, and then it doesn't. And I'm almost like, oh, it's like we both have kids, and sometimes your kid, when they start walking, they'll like do something a little bit more challenging than you think they're capable of, and they do it perfectly fine. You're like, oh, okay, I guess you do that now. And that's sort of been the experience for me of every time I've taken a step back. And like this most recent time, now I'm only practice like 4 hours a week. And so I go in and I go there and I talk to my office manager, and I'm almost expecting, to come in and have everyone be upset and have it not be running well. And every time I come in, I'm like, wow, okay, I guess we're doing this now. And it's almost like this, I don't know how to describe it. You have this, it takes an exercise of trust. I think that's the hardest thing for me, is to fully trust someone else and just trust them. That for me has been the hardest thing. And, I've gotten a lot better at it, but it's still something I struggle with. It's just like fully trusting someone.
Well, and with the trust, I think even upstream of the trust is the clarity of vision. Like in order for you to trust your office manager, you have to have first gone above and beyond to say, this is what our goal is, this is what we're shooting for, this is our process of how we do things. Then and only then can you trust that they're going to follow through with it. Because if there's any muddiness of that communication, then they're going to make mistakes. And then I'd say 80% of those mistakes can be traced back to poor communication on the front end. And that's where the extreme ownership stuff comes in. Like you have to say, okay, what could I have done differently to better train this person to keep them from possibly making that mistake in the first place? So, you can say, oh, the office manager screwed this up, or man, my front desk lead really garbled this. But at the end of the day, you're probably not communicating well enough. And that was more than likely causing that in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah, man. And let's circle back to the practice underwater stuff, because I think I got off track. But one of them that really comes to mind, I guess when I'm thinking back to previous episodes, is I think his name was Brock or Rock. I think it was Brock. And he was a new owner, and I looked at his practice by numbers, and he was ready for a third hygienist. He had two, and he had a third one that was only there part-time. And I was trying to talk him into bringing her on more. And I think the first part, he was kind of between solo or group, and we decided he was going to go group. And then he needed to grow his practice from maybe 1.5 to about 2. And, we talked about it, and he had just bought it. And he was really hesitant to bring on that other hygienist. This is a very common thing that dentists go through all the time, where they're very hesitant to bring on the extra hygienist because they don't like the openings. And I told him, like, okay, well, and we walked through, and this was the only time I've ever used this point on air to my recollection. I had him, I said, hey, how much did you buy your practice for? And he said how much he bought it for, I forgot. And then I said, when you're doing 2.2, how much is it worth? And he's like, okay, maybe about 2 million. I said, okay, and so how much did you gain of net worth and equity right there? And like some maybe $800,000. I'm like, okay, so is that free? No. Well, how do you earn it? Yeah, by taking risks and paying for hygienist hours when they're not seeing patients so that you have capacity to grow. And that was a concept that concept is very fundamental to our philosophy, is having space to grow. And then obviously retention is a big part of our philosophy. But that right there, that whole example, and that was, still early on. We still hadn't kind of gotten to a lot of the innovations that we have done in hygiene with value added per appointment and looking at the total value of a hygiene visit, the stuff that we do now. But back then, even we still had that philosophy in place. And, seeing that was the first time I really got to articulate it on air.
And in order to get to that point where you can really add that equity, add that value to the practice, another term that's been introduced into the shared practices lexicon is the ugly duckling phase.
Ugly duckling.
That is the ugly duckling phase, where you're on the cusp of needing a third hygienist, or you're on the cusp of being ready to hire an associate, but your staff cost might be a little high based on percentages of your gross. And if you look at your CPA report every month, you might be like, oh my God, I'm at 33% staff cost this month. This is horrible. This is not sustainable. But it's a means to an end. And that's where having an understanding of analytics and having an understanding of where your practice is trending, what you're scheduled for next month, what you're treatment planning this month relative to next month, like having a finger on the pulse of all those different elements can give you the knowledge and the wherewithal to take those risks, when in fact, armed with the right knowledge, they're not risky.
No, not at all.
They feel risky, but if you have a ton of overdue recare, or you have a glut of new patients, add the third hygienist. And if they're open half the time, that's okay.
And, going back to James, his first interview, he was an ugly duckling. I mean, that was a 2-doctor, 2.5 hygienist office doing 1.2 million. That's an ugly duckling.
That is ugly.
Yeah. And, just those few tweaks that we had talked about, getting him in the upper ones, that right there, his profit, his overhead goes up like nothing. That's like the whole, and Matt and I really, do you think we need to talk break-even point again, or do you think we've already hit this recently?
I think one of your recent episodes hit that pretty well, where you're talking about how your break-even point is the more critical thing to look at rather than overhead percentages.
Correct.
Where you try to know, okay, here's what my break-even point is, plus or minus a couple $1,000s each month, and then anything above that is what you gain.
So from James's perspective, him doing 100 a month versus 150 a month maybe is like $4,000 to $5,000 of extra expenses.
Yeah.
But that difference is huge, and so for him, it's a whole different world. And it's just that's the power of really knowing what it is holding you back, because then when you can do that, you can blow past your break-even point, you become more profitable. But I think that overhead percentage mentality is just really unhealthy.
Well, scarcity versus abundance. That's something we train on in Mastermind all the time, is you see certain personality types are attracted to tracking those metrics to the nth degree. And then other personality types are like, okay, that's more of like a suggestion. And I see the value in seeing that one little tiny snapshot of last month, but that doesn't define me. What does define me is the fact that I'm trending in the right direction and all these other metrics that can't be defined by a static snapshot like that.
Do you have another? I got one that I'm thinking of. Do you have one that you want to talk about, Practice Underwater episode?
I really like Donald.
I love Donald, man.
Yeah, Donald, like
you know who he is, right?
Yeah, Donald as a persona on the show is hilarious.
Yeah, Donald was one guy that was the first time that I really felt like, so Donald is now part of Mastermind. He was actually the first Mastermind only client. And the reason he even got the invitation was because of how well he did on his practice underwater interview. He impressed the heck out of me. And it was the first time that I saw somebody listen to our show, hear what we say, embody our philosophy, and understand their practice almost as well as we do. And now he's working with our coaching department, and he's, off to great things. And he just has, what a great mindset. He's a future pod leader in our mastermind for sure.
Yeah. And we've already got that in the works. You may not know it, but like that's happening already.
Oh, he already has a pod?
Well, yeah, it's like in the works right now.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great success story from someone who was new into ownership, saw the challenges that came with a limited physical footprint of a practice, and then thriving in spite of that. Very cool.
So I'm going to talk about, we have Jane, Gigi, Sarah. You know what I'm talking about?
The archetype.
Yes.
The archetype.
So this is, and then we got Katie on as a result, and Katie was supposed to be like the antithesis, and Ashley Hovis, who was our only non-anonymous guest.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know those names, so Jane was the very first practice underwater interview that ever happened. And this was, a woman dentist, female dentist who had done a startup, and she had a lot of staff turnover. And then we had Sarah, who was a female dentist who had done a startup, a lot of staff turnover. And then we had Gigi, who dropped one of my favorite practice underwater lines is talking about her staff saying, "I'm not sure which ones are going to make the COVID cut." So that was a good one. And yeah, so, that personality and right, women, they have a unique challenge as practice owners. Absolutely. And I don't know what it was about, and we had a call out for the chill ladies, and then we got Ashley and, Katie on air, and they're definitely a different type of owner. But, there's something about, and I think that, did we have any high turnover men?
I'm sure we do.
We do.
Probably undiagnosed high turnover men.
I know Matt would be, early in his career, he had some turnover.
Yeah. And I think it's like right now we're talking about it in terms of the female doctor tendency to have the turnover, but
it's not.
It's not just female. Like it happens with men too, and I would argue that it probably happens at least proportionally as much with men. I know that like with a lot of our female practice underwater guests, we've had the female dentist that struggles with bridging that gap with the team relationship.
Yeah.
And it's tough as a male or a female, but I think with females, with a lot of the female dentists I've talked to, is a lot of the team wants to default to being more buddy with you.
Yeah.
And they want to cozy up to you and maybe get like special treatment because you're a female dentist just like them. And that can create very difficult team dynamics. Whereas if you're a male in a predominantly female office, there's a little more delineation between doctor and team. So yeah, when you called out for, okay, where are my chill female practice owners at? Like they're there, but there's still that difficulty to navigate.
Yeah. And it's not by any means I hope it's not being perceived in a disempowering way to women. It's just, the ones that we had, and startups in general have more turnover because typically someone who does a startup, they care a little bit more about the way everything is done. It's a little bit more prone to micromanage, and those tendencies typically lead to more turnover versus when you walk in an acquisition, you're almost forced to be more laid back because you just inherited this team member. You kind of have to let some things that are unusual slide for a while until you kind of go and implement your own stuff.
It would be interesting to see what the ratio of female practice owners who start up is to female practice owners who opt to acquire.
That's a good point.
Because I feel like as a guy, it's easy to go in. Like most practices that are up for sale that can be acquired. What's the normal owner? A 55 to 65-year-old dude, old guy. I think it's easier for younger guys to bridge that relationship than it is for like a younger female to bridge that relationship.
I didn't even think about that. This is the first time I'm realizing this on air. It's because So right now we're graduating 50-50, 50% female, 50% men.
Yeah.
But 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when
God.
sellers of practices,
95 to 5, maybe.
it's like there was no women. So the amount of older women dentists just aren't there.
Right.
And so usually but I've noticed, so my mom was, female dentist who sold her practice to a female dentist, and female dentists like to transition to female dentists. And I think it's the same thing male to male. But I don't think it's male to male as big of a deal. I think it's more like a women to women. They like to transition and keep, female provider.
Right. And I think some patients might have a preference. Like I've seen that where some patients feel more comfortable with a female provider or a male provider, like it's personal preference kind of thing. I've seen that sometimes. But yeah, I feel like we've had a sample size of a lot of females that have opted to do startups. Maybe the demographics were good for it. Maybe they felt like this is the most straightforward path. Maybe I have a very defined vision. But yeah, that's an interesting thing I'd love to see some data on.
Yeah. And then I'll talk about, I forgot his fake name. Let me think. This was the guy that Matt interviewed. The problem is I know his real name. I can't think of it. Well, there was this dentist who bought this practice who they were checking for 3 hygienists at the time. And it was a solo doc wanting a group. And I think one of the things I noticed in his whole interview, and man, I wish I could remember this guy's fake name. Oh, Tommy. This was Tommy. And, Tommy, one thing I really noticed in his whole interview was how risk averse he sounded. He was looking for the metric that would tell him it'll be safe. And he's looking for the data that'll tell him that everything will be okay. And, the whole interview, I'm listening to him. He keeps trying to press Matt for the number. And, really the lesson was that there's no number. It's a risk. Like that's the game. And I think I was hard on him on the outro because he was really talking about this dream of this very large practice, this very big group. And he just didn't seem to have the intestinal fortitude or whatever it is to really stomach that process.
Yeah. And we even see that with coaching clients, with mastermind members, with a lot of the people in our ecosystem, is that some people innately need that data, need that roadmap, need that proven process before they're able to really jump off the cliff and figure it out. Some of us are wired to where we're ready to say, ready, fire, aim, so to speak. Yeah. Other people much prefer step 1, this, step 2, that. And it just seems like the people that are risk averse, that are worried about student loan debt, that are worried about managing a team, that are worried about overhead, those people do really, really well in a solo practice. And maybe they do the solo practice thing long enough and they get more comfortable with all those things. And then they say, you know what, maybe it wouldn't be that bad to really pump up the marketing and take a risk and then drum up the new patient flow and then bring on an associate. They get to that point to where they flex those muscles of leadership and of entrepreneurship to where, they push their own boundaries, because no growth occurs within your comfort zone. Nope. You have to push against those boundaries. And, there's a great many people that have great careers and that stay well entrenched in their comfort zone. But most people, I would argue, reach that tipping point where they say, you know what, screw this associateship. I want to own a practice. Or they say, screw this, 3-op practice. I want to have a bigger space. And there's a tipping point.
And I think kind of the point you're alluding to is I think initially when we started, which by the way, I want to call out Tommy because Tommy actually is, he's coaching with our coaching department. And yeah, I mean, he's, it's funny, him and James, I gave them a hard time in their interview. James, I said, can we fire you, the leader? And then actually turns out his leadership was really solid. And same thing with Tommy, turns out his ability to handle risk. It was months after the interview, but his ability to handle risk is much different than I thought it was. He's very bought into the process of becoming a group and that ugly duckling phase and everything that it's about. So, sometimes we get a snapshot of these people on air, and then, as you get to know them, they're definitely much different. But to your point earlier, initially we had solo and group as like this path you go down. You either go solo or you go group. And once you make the decision, that's it. But what we realized is the solo to group transition is something that we've learned about a lot. And it's something that we do quite often now. So it's like you can go solo and then transition to a group, assuming you have the operatory space.
It's all malleable. Like it's not like you have to declare one for the rest of your life. It's not like in Harry Potter where you get sorted into a house. Like you have.
What an analogy! Richard is going to love that.
You're welcome, Richard, Podfather. No, they're not mutually exclusive. You can go from one to the other, and we see the solo to group transition all the time. And you get in with a certain set of expectations, and then you realize, man, like I really wouldn't mind having another set of eyes on stuff. Because a lot of people I've talked to get into the group practice model simply because they yearn to have some camaraderie. They yearn to have a peer in the office under the same roof as them. And then there's other people that are like engineer minded where they're like, you know what, I am cool, I'm like huffing it out for 30 years all by my lonesome. I come from a family of engineers, so I can make fun of them. But yeah, like the people that can sit in a cubicle all day and they can just work on stuff, like a lot of dentists have some of those same traits. I'm not that way, but some people are cool with that. But then there's others of us that want the challenge of putting out fires with your team or solving big scheduling issues. Like that kind of stuff is fun to me, but not everyone is wired the same way. And that's the great thing about dentistry is there's such a multiplicity of paths.
Absolutely. Man, I really enjoyed this recap.
Me too.
I can't believe we've been doing Practice Underwater for, wow, it's been like almost a year and a half.
I know. And going back through all the notes, it struck me how many people's trajectories have been altered in a positive way from those interviews, because the anonymity of everybody except me now has been really, really good for everyone, just to see like, hey, you can have that level of comfort to talk about numbers and metrics and situations. And I mean, getting that vulnerability piece in there is what's so helpful to many people, because if you can't step back and be vulnerable, then there's no growth. I mean, George and I have worked together in another capacity to really hash out like, how do you get better as a person? And vulnerability for a lot of us guys is central to that. And one word of encouragement I would give to our audience is, don't be afraid to take a step back and say, where am I putting up walls? Where am I trying to be invulnerable, impenetrable? And where can I really take a look in the mirror and say, where do I need to improve?
Absolutely. And another thing that struck me as I'm really like bringing up names is how many of these docs we've worked with either in Mastermind or coaching department.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like almost all the ones we talked about, I know.
Yeah.
That's odd.
Well,
I didn't realize that until we had this interview.
Well, your term of ecosystem applies, because people that listen to the podcast almost inherently apply the principles, and they keep coming back for the principles, and they listen to the podcast more, and then they say, "Oh, there's a webinar," or there's some other tool out there that we can use," because a lot of the mastermind members are longtime listeners, and then the mastermind members tell their friends, and they become mastermind members and listeners. And really, the more people that are students of these principles, the more people we can say, hey, we really helped you build the practice of your dreams in some small way.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been such an honor to do this for the last, however long, 18 months. And I can't believe it hasn't gotten old. I think that's the part that is confusing to me.
No.
So, it's been a pleasure. And, thanks, Alex, for coming on.
Thank you for having me, George.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Practice Underwater. We'll see you guys next week.
If you're interested in one-on-one coaching with either Dr. George Hariri or Dr. Matt Garino, our contact emails are in the show notes.
And if you're interested in being on Practice Underwater as a guest, where we could look at your practice anonymously, you can go ahead and contact the email in the show notes and follow those directions to get on the show. Thanks, and we'll see you guys next week on Practice Underwater.